Hello and welcome to the Vaux Podcast series, an MMA India Voice and Council initiative powered by IVM. We all know that voice and audio as mediums are rapidly growing and hugely innovative and engaging. But there are several unanswered questions that come in the way of marketers adopting the medium, which is precisely what this series is looking to address. Today, we will be chatting up with an emerging technologies expert who will share with us his learnings and insights on how a marketer can attempt to measure the efficiency and efficacy of voice and audio as mediums for advertising. We will also try to address the challenges being faced, particularly when it comes to measurement of these mediums. So, on that note, let me quickly welcome Biswapriya Bhattacharjee, Director B2B and Technology at Kantar. He has been with Kantar for close to 2 decades and leads the technology market research practice there. Kantar is also on the MMA board and has been instrumental in enabling immense expertise when it comes to mapping future ready marketing insights. So, with that, who better than Biswa, a seasoned industry leader and an integral part of the MMA India Voice and Audio Council, to help demystify measurement in the voice and audio space? A warm welcome to you, Biswa. It's lovely to be chatting with you today.
Thank you, Moneka. Great pleasure to be here amongst you, and look forward to this exciting conversation.
Absolutely. Wonderful. All right. So, Biswa, as you know, today, our conversation is about how do we measure effectiveness of voice and audio as mediums, what is available today, how best can it be leveraged, what's probably getting developed, and how would that help marketers going forward, right? So that's our thematic. So let me break up our conversation into two parts. Let's first delve more on voice as a space and what it takes to understand measurement when it comes to voice. And then we'll do a similar deep dive for audio. So, my first question to you, Biswa, is whilst the gap in voice and audio measurement is very evident in the industry, how important is it in today's context for voice and audio as mediums to become a must have in the digital media mix? And what would it take to make that happen?
I think it's a $1 million question, and I think it's needless to say it's the most important thing to do today is to build measurements for measuring any platform. For example, MMA, the kind of ecosystem around voice and audio and the work we are doing as a part of the council is a path towards that direction. When it comes to measurement, right, is any platform, any channel that has actually done well globally has actually built itself on the back of very strong measurements and very strong KPIs.
Correct.
We all understand that, see, if when it comes to any platform or any, whether it's digital or traditional media, unless you have a proper measurement system, you would not know what to invest on. It's then all about your gut or somebody else's gut. Measurement brings in a common denominator which can be used for the purpose of ensuring that you are looking at things in a cohesive manner. Now, when we look at measurements as well, there are two levels at which we look at measurements, right? And more so from a digital standpoint. Right. One is when we look at measurements which come in from platforms, and that's very common in the digital world. Different platforms have measurements. They have their own sets of KPIs. Many of them are consistent as well in terms of the kind of KPIs you look at. It's very commonly used, not maybe in this parlance, but things like click-through rates, for example, in banner ads, for example, right? But these come in from the platform. And then and therefore restricted to the platform, the manner in which it captures, etc., may not be directly comparable with any other platform, or for that matter, any other. And then you have a set of measures that are consistent measures that build comparative across multiple platforms, and in many cases, multiple digital media as well. So there are these two sets of measurement nuances that one needs to look at: the consistent KPIs that come in from the platforms, and ones which are cross platforms and in many cases cross channels. Uh, when you look at building measurements in the digital world, it is important to have both. Uh, and
Right.
I think while we do make some progress in the measurements that come in from the platforms themselves,
Hmm.
we do
Hmm.
not make a lot of progress when we look at measurements which are across platforms, cross-platform measurements as such.
Understood. Understood. Interesting. So I think you've really set that up well for us to, go deeper into each of these aspects. And yes, like I understand that an important currency. If the stakes have to be higher in the space, if advertisers have to look at it more deeply to invest and make it kind of a must-have, sort of track in the media mix. So I guess as we evolve and work more closely as an industry together, that's bound to happen because the medium has immense potential. So, talking about the ecosystem, like you rightly said, it's still, in its nascency from a measurement standpoint, not consumption standpoint. Let's help our audience understand, the ecosystem a little more, right? What is the voice ecosystem like currently? We've heard, uh, voice ecosystem, and, sort of looked at it in a manner where we believe that voice assistance, voice enabled chat, voice search, voice commerce, these are some of the components which exist in the ecosystem when it comes to voice and the options available to engage with voice as a platform. So, what you being a technology research expert, how would you define that ecosystem and what would you say comprises it?
I think very important and a very pertinent question. As you rightly said, I think the voice has
Hmm.
actually leapfrogged over the past few years in particular, and measurement hasn't kept space
Hmm.
with it. Uh, if you look at the total number of voice users in itself in the country, and Kantar does this very huge study called iCube every year,
Right.
there are close to about 300 million voice users in the country across
Wow.
urban and rural, right?
Okay.
Which is almost 45% of the total internet users who use voice. So that's a huge number of people who use voice, right? Now, but when you look at how do they use voice, that's where it becomes very interesting. And I would move away from the manner in which you have classified uh,
Of course.
the voice, or you've categorized it. The way we prefer to look at, which is
Hmm.
a lot more helpful from a measurement perspective as well, is on voice, right? And if you look at it from that perspective, there are very clear cohorts that seem to emerge in terms of voice usership, and very clear usages that seem to emerge from a voice perspective.
Okay.
So there's one set of cohort of voice users who are essentially the urban elite voice users. They are the ones who would use an Alexa at home. They would automate their home systems. They would use voice for the purpose of switching on, switching out devices, and so on and so forth.
Hmm.
Right, and that's an emerging, growing segment, and of course, a very high user of voice today. And I'll come to some of the use cases within that as well. The other, which is a more critical component or a critical segment when it comes to voice usership, is the small town and rural users. A lot of them also being illiterate or knowing very little of, forget English, but even the local language.
Sure.
And the voice for them is essential in entry to the internet, right?
Hmm.
So everything that they do on the internet is using voice. So whether it is a WhatsApp that they would use, and they do use WhatsApp, they use voice for that purpose, or whether it is to entertain themselves or their family members, as the case might be, which is again based on voice. Now, if you look at basis this, the kind of use cases that emerge, you'd see a lot of the more advanced use cases of the kinds we want to talk about or we like talking about in our day-to-day lives, being a lot more focused amongst the urban emerging segment. But that's a very small segment, right?
Hmm.
If you look at the 300 odd million internet users or voice users rather, this would be less than 100 million, maybe even close to about 60, 70 million, not more than that, who would actually be using voice for a host of usages, whether it's in terms of controlling devices, whether it's in terms of listening to news, ordering stuff, etc. When it comes to the rural users and the non-English speaking users, the local language users, for them, the voice being an entry to the internet itself is being used for more um, basic or fundamental usages of internet, which is
Hmm.
essentially around communication and entertainment, right?
Hmm.
So given that the usage of voice and the manner in which it kind of morphs from
Hmm.
a more sophisticated user to a more emerging or a new user of internet is very
Hmm.
interesting. And that is the journey where the local language starts
Hmm.
playing very important role in the context of voice. So since you spoke about how voice evolving, I think there are three key elements that drive the evolution of voice, right?
Hmm.
One is its ability to do multiple stuff. So its ability to understand and control multiple gadgets, multiple devices, etc. That's one part. The
Hmm.
second part is for it to be available in local languages, maybe going into, in certain cases, dialects for some of the larger languages like Hindi, for example, in the Indian context. The third is also what is important is how do you actually seamlessly help the person move in their journey of internet usage from being a user or a consumer of communication and entertainment to somebody who can shop online, who can buy stuff online, and therefore you open up more opportunities for that person to be exposed to communication, advertisements, etc. as well. Today,
Hmm.
in the current context, you would see that a large majority of the voice users are actually not going to be your target audiences for advertising at all, because it will be very difficult for you to reach out to them and communicate to them in the language that they would prefer, giving them a message which they would uh, kind of need uh, in sync with what they're looking for, what their behaviors are, etc. So that would become a challenge in the current context, which can be addressed in only if these three things are taken into account.
Wow. That was a very, very wholesome way to address it and makes so much sense. So, from what I hear you say, is that there is a certain pattern and consumption behavior when it comes to an urban user, and there's a different kind of a pattern and consumption behavior when it comes to the rural user. But the bottom line is that the potential to get more internet users is higher in the rural areas, and which can be enabled via voice as a medium in a big way. So the more they engage with voice, the more likely it is that they will open the gateway to internet and do much more with it, just the way an urban user does. And in turn, the overall space grows more. So voice is definitely enabling a fair bit in that sense. And it's probably about getting the infrastructure in place and maybe sorting issues like measurement. So that's a very interesting take. Now that we've heard you define the ecosystem so richly, let's probably go dig a little more into the developments that are happening in the space when it comes to measurement, when it comes to advancements which further will propel higher usage and or better adoption for marketers. So, what according to you are those developments, and how will it help advertisers in the long term?
Well, I think the the way the measurement is evolving in voice
Yeah,
is, as we said, and you started off by saying, it lags the usership. So the
right.
usership has moved a fair bit ahead, but when it comes to measurement, it's still at a very primitive stage. We are looking at using a lot of the tools which are aligned or which have been created to measure audio, for measuring voice as well. And I'll talk about, when we get into audio as well, some of those. There aren't a lot of measures that are coming in which are voice-led measures, right? Because uh, there are certain technological limitations, there are certain limitations in terms of understanding various protocols to create something which is cross-platform. As I said, what is important is to start looking at cross-platform rather than making it very platform dependent. So if I were to look at a measure which is across a CD, a Google Assistant,
Hmm.
an Alexa, for example, and have
Hmm.
consistent measures, right? I will need to have technological solutions which
Hmm.
can actually read uh,
Hmm.
what's happening on each of these platforms, and that's not very easy to do.
Hmm.
Also, what's happening is that there are multiple gadgets that are coming in with voice,
Hmm.
multiple touch points where you are actually interacting with a voice device. So what do I measure? Do I measure an individual, which is what, as an advertiser, I would like to know how is that individual across devices is interacting with voice,
Right.
vis-a-vis measure the device,
Hmm.
right? Now, measuring device is a lot simpler than measuring what that individual does across multiple touch points
Right.
of voice, right? So those are challenges that one is grappling with. Uh, I- there are measurements that are being put in place for this. It's not that there aren't. But is there something which is exclusively for voice, or which really brings the power of voice forth to the marketeers and the advertisers? I would say there are solutions, but it'll take time to reach a level where they can be available at a level where marketeers can truly use it. So, for example, there are solutions where you can actually listen to whatever are the voices that are being used by.
Hmm.
So it's not a technology device, but it's a solution that sits maybe on your phone, and the phone can listen into what's happening in the surrounding. So
Hmm.
if you are carrying a phone, irrespective of whether you are using the phone itself for voice, or you are using any of the other devices that's in the vicinity,
Hmm.
for you to use it for voice commands, the phone is able to pick that up as a signal
Hmm.
and attribute it back to you.
Right.
Right, so there are solutions of that nature, but are they really available? In some degree, yes, but not really at a level where they become standardized KPIs for marketers to use it. Kantar, for example, is doing a lot of experiments in this area as well, and we might have something available as such on similar areas. But I think that's true for a lot of the other companies as well.
Got it. Got it. I think that's useful. And whilst it's good to know that there is enough, measures being taken to build something more robust, which can measure, the effectiveness at a cross-platform level, which is usually important because I agree with you, voice is not being used in isolation by one kind of device, but it's used across multiple devices. So how the user interacts across devices becomes extremely important to measure, and that's a complicated, long-drawn process. But in the absence of it, I believe the kind of studies folks like you do, or the way you kind of put out research to understand user behavior, etc., becomes a fair bit of a good reference in that sense for for the investments to be sort of enhanced in a space like voice, right? Because that gives you the
Yeah.
perspective and the numbers one needs to be looking at. And there is, of course, no taking away the fact that experiments need to happen, and the more they happen, the more kind of learnings it builds for the overall industry. So on that note, I want to shift focus, given that voice and audio technically complement each other in many ways. And this is a session where we're trying to learn and understand about voice and audio both. So let me pick your brains a little now on the audio space, right? So when it comes to audio, right? It is definitely a lot more organized. It's been around for longer, and the code is sort of, kind of cracked. At least the first stage is looking like it's in the right direction. So, we've heard of stuff like a listen through rate and a completion rate, right? So there is some amount of metric measurement that is happening in the space. So what are your views on it, and how do you think that is helping a marketer?
Well, as you rightly said, I think audio is something which is a lot more organized in terms of
Yeah.
measurement. The fact that we have been measuring radio also helps
Yeah.
build the right set of measures for uh, the audio, because a lot of it can actually be picked up from there as KPIs and kind of measured. I think audio sits at a cusp of what you're doing from a video OTT perspective at one hand and radio at the other end, and therefore you can bring in what you've learned as best practices from either or both of them together to
Hmm.
create some of the KPIs for audio. So to that extent, I think listen through rate is one measure which has come out, and it's being spoken about uh, as 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 a, as a as a strong KPI. And I do believe that there are lots of such KPIs that one is looking at. Means from the point of from the point of reach to the point of actually completing.
Hmm.
All of these are actually very important.
Right.
Now, when we look at measurement, and maybe I'll
Hmm.
take a step back,
Hmm.
there are four pillars that we look at, right?
Okay.
Uh, it's reach, frequency, engagement, and action, right?
Okay.
So at the end of the day, when you're looking at measurement, you should be able to measure all of these four. Uh,
Hmm.
it's not good enough for you to have one or two or three of them. Now, with a lot of this, you can actually do reach and frequency, right?
Yeah.
So even LTR, for example, is a frequency measure. So whether the people have actually gone through the content or not.
Hmm.
How do you measure engagement and action
Hmm.
continues to be a challenge
Hmm.
in the current world,
Mm-hmm.
right? And when you look at engagement uh, with the audio in particular, there are challenges because we have seen through multiple researches that people multitask while listening.
Hmm.
So it's listening is not a dedicated activity that one does. It's always in the background, and
Hmm.
therefore you really don't know what is the level of engagement that you are having of the audience at that point in time, and therefore the communication that you are sending out, the advertisement that has been played, for example, has it at all registered with the
Right.
audience? Right. So in the context of say OTT, we say that in a lot of cases you would skip an ad because you are so engrossed in
Correct.
watching the content.
Correct.
In while listening, you may not do that because you while you are listening, you let it flow because you are already caught up doing something else, right? So the effort that one has to take to move
Hmm.
from that activity to coming to your phone and skipping it or otherwise is a significantly high effort that is required.
Hmm.
So those could be some of the other elements because of which you would have completion rates being high. You could have
Hmm.
your LTRs being high,
Hmm.
uh, and therefore the engagement becomes very important a lever for
Hmm.
you to measure.
Hmm.
Now, how do you measure engagements? There are, of course, various ways in which you can measure engagements. Passively, it continues to be a bit of a challenge to measure engagements. Uh, Sorry, so passively it does become a little bit of a challenge to measure engagement. But when you look at through survey data, there are ways in which one measures engagement as such. So
Hmm.
um, there has to be a combination of sources that would actually come together
Hmm.
to help us measure the entire of those four pillars.
Right.
Uh, so the way one would envisage is you would have certain passive measures which would help you measure reach, frequency. You would have some active measures which would help you
Hmm.
measure engagements. And then you would have a combination of active and passive measures. Well, what I mean by active measures is things like survey, direct questions, etc. And then you have some active or passive measures to see what is the action that one is taken, what is the impact, what is the attribution, etc. So that's how one would possibly need to build a measurement uh, platform which would help address this requirement.
Useful, very, very useful. Yeah. So I heard you say something very interesting where you said audio is like cusp between radio and OTT, and therefore there is a lot of learning it can borrow at from both ends, and become more and more organized, more and more measurable, as a medium. So it has that advantage for sure. And yeah, absolutely, like any other medium, reach, frequency, engagement, action become important parameters to measure. So it's not about saying, okay, LTR is enough or completion rate is enough. It's always a combination of factors which one needs to look at depending on the objective that one has in mind for the medium. So I think that is actually very enriching to understand, and appreciate you sharing this with us. As we speak more about audio, what I would want to probably get a perspective on is, we would agree that there are more mature players, there are more mature markets when it comes to audio than India, because I mean, that journey for India has begun much later, right? So are there any learnings that we could allude to, or any insights that we can share on what is it that can catalyze our journey in the audio space through the mature markets and first movers that we've been witnessing?
Well, I think three things. I think means the advantage at a global level today is technology and measurement solutions
Right.
are no longer held by one country or one geography.
Hmm.
Once they are developed and they are kind of perfected to some extent, uh, they move very quickly to different parts of the world. Uh, what stops adoption of many of these solutions, many of the technologies is a combination of things. One, of course, is the cost. And at the initial stages, some of these technologies can cost a lot. And the second is how much are we as marketeers, as advertisers, and as platform owners as well, committed to delivering a very strong measurement solution uh, to our ecosystem as such, right?
Right.
I think if we are able to look at these two and address these two, and the second one is a lot more important than the first, because if we can get the second to happen, then people can actually come together and justify the costs as such.
Right.
If we can address that, I don't think India is way behind in
Mm-hmm.
terms of being able to measure some of these platforms. Uh, the learnings that I have spoken about in terms of the pillars, in terms of the passive measures, and in the context of voice, picking up the surround environment, the ambient environment, voice, and how you measure, are typically the kind of solutions that are used along with some of the measures that you spoke about, like LTRs, completion rates, etc., to
Right.
measure audio globally and in some of the matured economies as well, right?
Mm.
It is then about institutionalizing them and kind of putting in those as key matrices that one can take forward, similar to what we have done in the TV and in recent past in the radio as well, right? It's about institutionalizing some of those mechanisms. So the measures don't change. It is once we have agreed to it, once we have institutionalized it, it becomes a lot more usable and more relevant from a stakeholder standpoint.
Understood. Yeah, I think that sums it up pretty well, because it's about institutionalizing, and therefore, coming together in forums like the kind we are engaged in, like, a body which can sort of help and bring consensus, build consensus, create best practices, is what would probably enable adoption of common currency, which would in turn then, make the entire journey a lot more valuable for an advertiser and a solution provider. So I think that again is a fair perspective, and makes perfect sense. So before I let you go, I'm going to take one last question. And we've touched upon voice and covered some diverse aspects there. We've done a similar exercise with audio, but how can audio, be left, complete? How can we say audio is like a complete conversation unless we don't talk about podcasting, right? And podcasting is definitely a valuable medium. We are using exactly that to have a conversation like this, wherein the kind of insights and the kind of depth we've been able to extract would never be possible otherwise, however hard one tries using other touch points to do so. So we do understand it's powerful, we do understand it's valuable, right? But it is still, adoption is still small. Though there is great quality of content out there, there is a lot of loyalty amongst those who are following certain podcasts which they believe suits their interests or needs, right? So, how do you recommend? Uh, what would you have to say when it comes to how should a medium like podcast be measured, and how would one be able to sort of understand the effectiveness of podcasting if it were made a part of the overall creative set of assets,
Yeah, I think it's a very important aspect of the entire audio segment, because
Right.
podcast is where you'd possibly see a lot more active listeners than passive
Yeah.
listeners. So that's one of the things that we've seen, that wherever we have, so you're right, it's a small audience, right, compared to
Yeah.
the kind of audience that we have when it comes to audio, which is what, 400 million odd audio users. Podcast is about
Mm,
27, 30 million users. So it's a much smaller number, right? It's just
correct.
about 10% or even lower. But the kind of people that you'd have, you spoke about the quality of content, but it's also the quality of the users that you have, which is very different when it comes to podcast, and the fact that
Mm,
there's a lot more active listening that happens in podcast when compared to audio,
right.
because in audio it's a lot more about music uh, as such. There's a fair bit of other stuff, but it is dominated by music. While in podcast, it's a lot more conversations. It's a lot more of learning that you would have.
Yes.
And when you're looking at podcast, you seek podcast. You don't
Yeah.
really happen to stumble on a podcast. So given that your attention span being that much higher, uh, your ability to retain the content that you have gone through is also that much higher, right? So the way I look at podcast is that it's a small, we shouldn't look at it by numbers, but we should look at it from a perspective of quality of content, that
Mm,
the quality of users that the podcast has, and therefore it
mm,
becomes a very interesting source for marketing, right? Because when you have engaged users, you know that they are actively engaging in listening in. You know that there is an opportunity for you to market there,
right.
and therefore I believe that podcast is here to stay and here to grow.
Mm,
uh, it will be one of the core marketing uh, platforms that people will seek. We haven't
mm,
seen the demand for podcast go up to the extent
mm,
that it should have, given that there are
mm,
25 or 30 million odd users who are there. Uh, when it comes to measuring podcasts, that's the question that you have.
mm,
I won't say that the measurement solutions would be any different from the ones that we would have for audio. At the end
correct.
of the day, it is an audio. So you would still look at measuring it in the same manner as you would measure the audio. As we evolve and as we start seeing the emergence of very specific kinds of platforms, and if the delivery mechanisms of podcasts change, then yes, you might have to look at a different way of measurement. But at this point in
Hmm.
time, given whatever we can see in the horizon, I think the measurement solutions need not necessarily be very different. As a matter of fact, it might help the industry to have a measurement solution which is similar across both audio and podcast.
Makes sense. Makes sense. Yeah, though I would assume that time spent and repeat usage would probably over-index a little more in case of podcasting, given the nature of the medium. And like you rightly said, it's about
Yeah,
retention, at the end of the day. So, right?
exactly. And that's where your KPIs remain the same.
Yeah,
And therefore, you'd still measure time spent in audio, and you measure time spent
yeah.
here. It's just that you are getting that much higher time spent here, and therefore that much more avenue for you to do things with this set of audience than what you have in the audio space as such.
Fantastic. So I agree with what you said, and as you put it, that podcasting is all about the quality of users versus quantity. So one should definitely keep investing into podcasts, be it in terms of creating, high quality content, or using the created podcast to distribute it widely across platforms, so that over a period of time the consumption keeps growing. On that note, I think this was a wonderful conversation, extremely insightful, and some fantastic views. Given your expertise and given the depth of work Kantar is doing, I think this was very, very valuable, and we're so thrilled to have you engaged as a part of our walk series. I do want to say a big thank you on behalf of our council, on behalf of MMA, and I am sure the audience is going to take away a lot of insights from this discussion and will definitely feel a lot more upbeat about times to come when it comes to measurement and voice and audio. While what it still means is that don't stop experimenting, don't treat it as a limitation to keep trying different use cases with voice and audio. Correct. So on that note, appreciate having you engaged. Thank you again. So let me close the podcast by saying, by letting our viewers know that we'll be back with another podcast soon, and will continue being as insightful as this one was, because we believe voice and audio has undoubted potential and we need to keep at it. Till we meet again, thank you once again and have a wonderful day ahead.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks a lot. Been a great pleasure
Thank
talking to
you.
you, Monica.